Well, welcome everyone to the How to Place a Bid webinar for our upcoming Spectrum lease auction. Before we get going, and Andreas, who has just joined us, will be conducting the majority of the webinar, I do want to announce and make some description of our extra read all about it news. So this is something we've been waiting for in the 2.5 gigahertz community for many years. We now have an informal proposal, and soon the FCC will vote to start the formal process called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, which can make available the additional EBS spectrum licenses that cover a total of about half of the geography of the country and something like 10% of the population of the country. And so this is, I think, very good news that this process is moving, and we are optimistic that in the end the FCC will issue rules that are very positive for EBS. But after I give that brief description, then Andreas will give a more complete description of the process of identifying licenses that you can bid on, assessing the value of those licenses, and actually placing a bid so that everyone will be ready for the lease auction with bids due on the end of the day, actually 11 p.m. Eastern on this Thursday. So to move forward on the actual description of the FCC EBS, Educational Broadband Service, NPRM, which is a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, we expect the FCC to approve the rulemaking process on on its May 10th meeting, and then we'll have comments and reply comments. My hope and expectation is that this could be resolved this year. We'll see whether that will happen or not, but the summer could be a very active time in terms of the comments going into the FCC. The first step in this will be the expansion of existing licenses. In many cases, existing licenses have gaps between them. So this is positive for the existing license holders, and it's positive for all of the parties that lease those licenses, so to those commercial operators. There may be some renegotiation of leases to accomplish this, and but in general, many of the leases already provide that if the license expands, the commercial operator is allowed to use the expanded area. As I mentioned, this has actually been pending for a long period of time at the FCC. It goes back in some ways all the way back to the 2005 timeframe when the FCC changed the rules, and then more recently to 2008 when the FCC invited some suggestions on how to allocate licenses. And over half of the country geography has open areas where there's no EBS license. So finally, now after some pressure from Select Spectrum and from some commercial operators that we work with, some schools as well, the FCC has come out with a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking that basically lays out how they would allow the rest of the country where there are no existing 2.5 gigahertz EBS licenses, or where there's gaps, to be filled out. And we think obviously to get that done is going to be a huge benefit to commercial operators and to this band in general, and also to educators who have not previously had the advantage of these licenses. So it would be essentially a three-step process. The first would be existing license holders could apply. They'd have, sounds in this proposal, they'd have to apply to expand their license. There's a variety of options that the FCC lays out there on how those would expand. But the general concept is to fill in relatively small areas between existing licenses that are currently not allocated, and therefore no transmissions are allowed in those areas. Then the next step would be a chance for tribes in rural areas, not necessarily in urban areas, according to the NPRM as it's drafted, to apply for licenses covering their areas. And potentially they could apply for all of the vacant channels, the way I see it. So there's a proposal there for comments that that they would be allowed to, if there was 100 megahertz, they could apply for all of it. And finally, the third step in this opening for application is that educators would be allowed to apply for licenses where they have a local presence. And this is really opened up not necessarily to all educators, but only to those educators who've not previously had an EBS license. So that's the three-step process. Once they go all the way through that, if there are areas where there are no applications, they would be opened up to a bidding process with commercial operators being allowed to bid and to acquire the licenses. And interestingly, if there were no applications for a license, it could be auctioned. And if there were competing applications for a license, it could be auctioned. And it goes back to the existing statute that basically provides that for a wide variety of license bands, including the 2.5 gigahertz and sort of unfortunately and perhaps mistakenly including the EBS band, if there's competing applications, then auction is what the FCC is directed to do. You may recall, if you looked at the FCC's the prior consensus proposal to the FCC, which was authored by the National EBS Association, the Catholic Telecommunications Network, and WCAI, which is the Wireless Communications Association, and represents commercial licensees. The proposal was that this would essentially be a first come, first serve, and essentially competing applications would not be possible because as soon as a valid application was received in a particular location, the window would close down. There wouldn't be a time for a second application. So I think this is, by the way, one of the areas where the current NPRM is perhaps a bit flawed. I don't think it's realistic to assume that there won't be, in some cases, competing applications. And in that case, if there are competing applications, essentially it could get pulled out of the hands of the local educators and potentially out of the hands of smaller companies that might not be able to afford to bid in an FCC auction for a license. So if we can go forward, here's my predictions based on a very brief review of the notice of proposed rulemaking. I think, first of all, there is a proposal in there to essentially take away the educational reservation. As it is now, educators are allowed to lease the license, but it can't be held by a commercial entity, and 5% has to be reserved for educational use. So I expect many educators will object to that, even though it gives them the chance to sell their license. It really, in the long run, I think takes the majority of the educational benefit out of this band. I do expect competing applications. I think that these are valuable licenses that can provide excellent service in urban and rural areas, and there will be demand for them, and there will be parties, including Select Spectrum, frankly, that will be advocating that educators apply for them. So the news will get out, and under this situation, I think we'll have competing applications, and the result under this proposal would be that things would go to auction. But I do think ultimately this is going to be increased value in the band for whoever ends up holding the licenses, and for the operators. This finishes the national coverage. The band's been successful without full national coverage. Will be much more successful with full national coverage. And I think that if done right, this provides a lot of openings for fixed wireless operators in smaller rural communities. So in my view, all of that is positive for those of you who are ready to bid. And now I think we have Andreas ready to talk you through the process of bidding.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andreas Bitsarakis. Bob, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm extremely pleased and excited to be a part of the Select Spectrum team and assisting everyone in any way they need. Here is my email. And also here is my office phone. So anyone, if you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out, and I'll be able to assist you with any questions or concerns. So today we'll be going over how to place a bid We'll be going over the net present value lease calculator, give you somewhere to start when trying to develop your bids. We'll show you the process, how to develop bids, how to process the bids, and how to submit the bids, and a few of the website features. All right, so what we'll start by doing is to go to selectspectrum.com. As you see in the URL bar. The first step is to log in using the credentials you created during registration. I'm already signed in. So this is going to bring up a map of everything in the auction. So as I'm sure you notice, you have light blue circles and then you have a darker shade of blue. The difference between these two circles are committed license and not committed license. So the darker circles are entities and license holders that actually have hired Select Spectrum to market their license for a lease. And below, you have all the different licenses that are available. You can see that they illuminate as I put the cursor over them. So I'm over the University of Colorado at Boulder, and you can see that that small circle in Denver lit up when I rolled my mouse over it. So I want to go over a few of the columns and what they mean. So the first column is going to be the call sign. The second is going to be the spectrum rights holder. The third is going to be the channels included. The megahertz comes next, the center county, center state, example city, the population, the megahertz pop, and then you have a column here called ALA, which stands for Active Listing Agreement. If it says no, then it is an uncommitted license and the license holder didn't hire Select Spectrum to market their license, but we would still encourage everyone to make offers if it is of interest, and I'll go over why that is. Give it a second, and then it'll show everything in Kansas. So there's quite a few licenses available in Kansas. For example's sake, we're going to use WLX 927. Once I click that, you see how it zooms in and it shows the GSA of the specific license. So for this license, call sign WLX 927 has a population of 149,318. And it is a committed license. One column that I failed to mention was the last column here, EBS or BRS. So this will state if it's a EBS license or a BRS license. So this is important as well. And you can find that here. So once you find the license that you're interested in, and you might be interested in multiple licenses, but I'm just going to use one for example's sake. So I'm interested in WLX 927. What I want to take from this website is the megahertz and the population. So now we're going to jump back to Select Spectrum website.com/SLA. Now, this page is extremely important. It'll show any relevant information in regards to the 2.5 gigahertz auction, as you see here. We place our webinars here, any updates, so on and so forth. A general map. We were obviously looking at the detailed map before. There we go. Well, I'm sorry about that. There we go. Also, you have some really important resources here. So you got the 2.5 gigahertz spectrum lease auction summary. Some other important things that we'll be looking at today is the lease net present value calculator spreadsheet, and this is what's going to help you to find out where you should start in developing your bids, and a few other things that we're going to be going over a little later in this presentation. So where I want to start here is downloading the lease net present value calculator. So I'm going to download that. Okay, I actually already have it downloaded, but you see how to download it there. And I'm just going to pull that up now. Here we go. So here's the NPV calculator. Pretty self-explanatory, but I want to go over it a little bit in detail. So the green cells here are where you're going to input the information that we took from the map that we just previously looked at. So the default here is 22.5 megahertz. We're going to leave that alone. The population, if you remember, was 146,343. So once I click out of this cell, you're going to see everything change to be appropriate for those numbers. So as you see, we're going to keep the price proposal at 5 cents per megahertz pop. Now, what we've realized is due to increased interest in the market, this is a fair evaluation for megahertz per pop. Last auction, it was 4 cents. And like I said, because of increased interest, we've suggested that it should come up to 5 cents. So this brings us to a target value of $164,636 as a target value. Upfront payment would be $16,464. Megahertz pop located in cell E6 is going to be $3,292,718. Initial annual rent, initial monthly rent, annual increase. So let me take a step back and just mention that this is just a tool and a guide. So you're obviously going to make sure that all these numbers and everything are cohesive with your business plan and your growth plans. And we hope that a calculator like this will help you achieve that. These are all defaults. So for example, the 3% increase, it can be really anything that you want. Along with the price proposal, we recommend this, but ultimately at the end of the day, it's your bid and it can be lower or higher or whatever you choose it to be. So a few modifications that we can make, which makes this spreadsheet really helpful. So say for example, I don't know, $16,464 of upfront payment. You wanted to make it a nice round number. We can change that to an even 20,000, and it'll change everything along with it. We can also change the annual increase. So say we want a, I don't know, 2.5% increase. Everything will be modified along with the initial monthly rent. So $954, say we like working in round numbers, let's just make it an even 1,000. You see starting in cell C13 that everything starts at 1,000 now. So this is pretty straightforward. I believe you can modify this and do a few different scenarios to see what might work best for you. So that being said, we're going to keep this scenario upfront payment. We're going to want to take that information down so we're able to submit our bid. The population we have already. So what we're going to do now is actually jump back onto the website. There we are. And what we're going to do is log in. And if you see up here, there's a green button that says place a bid. So we're going to go ahead and click that button and we're going to download that bid application. So I took the liberty to actually fill one out before this presentation to not bore everyone with me typing. So let's jump to that. Here we go. So you're going to fill all this out appropriately. Pretty follow the bouncing ball, right? Bidder, organization, legal name. And put your company name there, your state of your organization, the street address, the responsible representative's name who's going to be dealing with all of this, the title, your email, office phone, and mobile phone. This is incredibly important. So make sure all this is accurate and filled in because when we hear back from someone or whatever, it helps with the logistics and just making sure that we're able to contact everyone efficiently and effectively. The date of the application. All right, so the call sign, if you remember, that we're using for an example is WLX927. So we have that filled in here. What this speaks to here, the earliest effective date requested and the latest acceptable effective date. We encourage you, oh, I'm sorry, I made a little typo. Let's just change this to 19. We encourage and advise everyone to try to make these as long of a period as you possibly can. As you know, we're dealing with a lot of educational institutions, and sometimes things just take a while to get done and to receive that final board approval. So this will definitely help you, and we advise everyone to try to leave as long of a term as you possibly can. You're going to fill in your requested initial term. Here I put 5 years, and then you're going to put a maximum total term, including all renewals. The reason why this is 30 years is that the FCC limits EBS spectrum leases to a maximum total term of 30 years. So this number can't exceed 30 years. So just make sure you know that. The upfront payment amount in this case, I believe, was even $20,000, right? We wanted a nice round number. The initial periodic payment, and we made that another round number, and that's going to be $1,000 per month. And this can all be modified concerning what you're looking for. The annual increase percentage we use as an example of 2.5%. Number 22, describe any other proposed payments, one-time payments, renewal payments, or other types of special payments. So say you wanted to do a balloon payment down the line or an anniversary payment, so on and so forth. You can list that here. Service credits. So EBS licenses requires for a fraction of the capacity of the license to be used for educational purposes. So that's why you see this here. We got 5 free connections valued at $50 per connection, which gives you a monthly amount of $250 of service credits. Number 25, we have list any other compensation, benefits, or services proposed to be provided by bidder to spectrum rights holder. So that's pretty self-explanatory. If you want to let them know anything, you can fill that in here. Beyond use of the spectrum and other typical provisions of spectrum leases, list any specific bidder requirements or requests for consideration of spectrum rights holder. Also pretty self-explanatory, so you can fill in anything you would want the spectrum rights holder to know here. Anything additional related to the bid, you can fill in number 27. So if we have all this completed, we're going to save it, and then we're going to jump back to the Select Spectrum website. So where I left off, this is where I downloaded the bid application, remember. And what we advise everyone to do, just so it's easier to sort and find things, is title your bid name, the entity name. So I'll put Select Spectrum. And then the call sign. So in this case, the example was what? WLX 927. We're going to choose that file to upload, which is going to be right here. I'm going to choose that. So in this case, actually, I'm going to label this test so we know it's just a test bid. Also, if you'd like, you can email your bids to bids@selectspectrum.com. This usually helps, say, if you have multiple bids. So in that case, I want to mention, if you do have multiple bids, we ask that you just complete a sheet for each of them, and then it might be easier in that case just to attach them all to an email and send them to us that way. So I'm all set here. Everything's attached. I've named it appropriately. Let's press upload. All right, up top, your bid has been received. And shortly after you submit your bid, you should also receive an email. If you don't receive an email confirmation, please let us know. All right, that seems, it looks like we covered pretty much everything. So I thank you all for participating in this webinar. And like I said earlier, if you have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email or phone.